So the last section in chapter 17 is principles of macroevolution. So we've now talked about what macroevolution is, how it happens, different pre-zygotic, post-zygotic, adaptive radiation, all those should be familiar to you. So after you've read section 17.3, you'll know all about the different principles of macroevolution. So the first thing that your textbook says is that it's important to remember that macroevolution happens very, very slowly. And so, so there's two different models that we look at. One is the gradualistic model of macroevolution, and one of them is the punctuated equilibrium model. So remember, this is how species change and looking at the broad scope of an evolution of an entire group of organisms from a common ancestor. So the first one is called the gradualistic model of macroevolution. And this says that species evolve really gradually. So speciation, forming of new species, as a species splits into two, or as one changes over time, you remember that, because it occurs as populations become isolated. So that would be an example of what kind of speciation I'm testing you. Allopatric speciation. And that happens when two species get separated by a geographic barrier. And so each population follows its own evolutionary pathway. So they start off with a common ancestor right here, this orange bird. They got separated for whatever reason, isolated, and it could have been sympatric speciation if they were isolated in a different manner, if they stopped recognizing each other's mating calls, anything like that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a geographic isolation, but they become isolated in their evolutionary pathways, and they go in two different directions. So this top one, new species 1, evolved a coat color of yellow, and this one evolved a coat color of red. You can see it. Oh, part went away. So it's hard to tell in the gradualistic model exactly when a new species is formed because there's a lot of different transitionary steps. So, for example, this one went to a little darker orange, then a little darker, and now it's red. So when exactly did it become a different species from this guy up here? It's hard to tell because these changes are happening so slowly over such a long period of time. The other model is called the punctuated equilibrium model. And the punctuated equilibrium model came after studying the fossil record a lot. And the scientists saw that species remained unchanged for a very, very long period of time, and then all of a sudden, something would happen. So this period of unchangingness is called stasis. Equilibrium, things are staying the same. And either what would happen after this equilibrium is these species would go extinct, or they would very quickly evolve into a new species. So they weren't changing slowly over time, changes were happening very rapidly. Rapidly being several 100,000 years, but still more rapidly than the gradualistic model. So the period of stasis, or equilibrium, gets interrupted or punctuated by abrupt rapid change. That's what that says. I don't know if you can see that. Rapid change. And so this model is called the punctuated equilibrium model. And so what that says is here we have our same ancestral species, and it stays the same for a long time, but for whatever reason, this guy diverged really quickly and became a new species. Same thing down here. All of a sudden, the red one diverged and became a new species right away. And so, but it stayed the same after it became a new species. So it wasn't gradually happening. The selection pressures, for whatever reason, the evolution happened very, very quickly. So that's a punctuated equilibrium model. So you can see the difference. Here we can see in the punctuated equilibrium model exactly where a new species formed in the fossil record. Over here, it's hard to tell because there's so many different transitional links, and if we were looking at the fossil record, we wouldn't necessarily be able to say, okay, this guy became a new species right here, because depending on what model of speciation we're looking at, we can't mate fossils together to see if they can make offspring, so it's hard to tell. So that's gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium. So then your textbook goes on to talk about developmental genes and macroevolution. So it talks about three in particular: the PAX6 gene, the HOX gene, which we've talked about before, homeobox genes, and the TBX gene, TBX5 gene. And the question that it raises is, how do genetic changes in what proteins are made, because remember, that's what it is. Our DNA makes proteins, and that affects everything. So how do changes in our proteins bring about such drastic changes in our form? So how do changes in genes make us different from chimpanzees, make us different from wolves, make us different from bananas? How did that happen? And so basically what happens, if we're going to look at it, us compared to chimpanzees, the genes will either stop a process early or allow it to continue for an extended period of time. So that's how developmental genes affect who we are. So there's going to be transcription factors. So if you think about it, we have much longer limbs than a dog. And so for whatever reason, when our ancestors split from the dog ancestors, or that's a bad example. Let's think about a chicken and a snake. So a snake has tons and tons of vertebrae, and there is a very, very long spine. A chicken has a much shorter spine, and it has a neck, whereas the snake doesn't necessarily. So how did developmental genes make a difference there? Think of it this way. So let's say that a particular species has a gene that says you're going to have this many vertebrae, and these proteins are going to make it, and that's what's going to happen. If the gene that makes that happen is on for a longer time, then it's going to have more vertebrae. And if it's on for a lesser amount of time, then it's going to have shorter vertebrae. So developmental genes stop a process early or allow it to happen for longer, and so that's how we get such drastic changes in form, in body shape. That's why there's so many different body types for different humans, or I'm sorry, for different living things. But the fact that we all rely on these developmental genes suggests a common ancestor. So the fact that we all have PAX6, HOX, and TBX genes suggests that somewhere along the line we are a common ancestor, and that's where those developmental genes came from. So development of eye. You know that a lot of different kinds of animals have eyes. And there's different kinds of eyes, such as compound eyes, which things like bugs have, and camera-like eyes, which we have. We have actual lenses in our eyes that basically take pictures and send them to our brain, and our brain makes them into an image that we see. And these are all regulated by the PAX6 gene. The thing is that we have compound eyes, and we have camera-like lens eyes, but there's other living things like flies, crabs, and other arthropods. They have compound eyes, but they are much more closely related to squid and octopi than we are. But squid and octopi also have camera-like lens eyes. So that's saying something about convergent evolution. So it would be too crazy for all of us to have evolved a similar eye totally differently. And so that's how scientists came to the conclusion that we all had a common eye development gene, which is the PAX6 gene, which they studied and researched and shows that that's what causes the development of the eye. There's an image on page 321 of the different kinds of eyes, and you can see that our eyes are much more similar to that of an octopus than that of a fly. The next gene it talks about, the TBX gene, TBX5 gene. And so this is involved in formation of limbs. And so TBX5 is actually a transcription factor. And so it turns on the genes needed to make limbs during development. And so birds and humans both have the TBX5 gene. So do a lot of other living things. So however long the TBX5 gene is left on for, whether it's cut off early, left on for a longer time, whether if it's affecting different genes, that's why our limbs are different than that of a bird, although very similar because the same process is happening. We have the same bones in our arms as birds do in their wings, but since it's a developmental gene, however long we leave the TBX gene on for or turn it off, it's going to affect how our limbs are formed. And then lastly, the development of overall shape. So this is kind of what I talked about when I talked about the snake vertebrae and the chicken vertebrae. The HOX genes regulate the vertebrae because they have repeating segments. You know, there's a bunch of vertebrae running down your back. And so however you leave this on for is going to code for how many vertebrae you have and how big they are. And so that's controlled by the HOX genes. And that got kind of messy, but then the last thing that your textbook leaves you on this chapter is that macroevolution is not goal-oriented. So in the development of the horse so this horse up here, the modern horse Equus, I'm actually going to go to this picture. Equus up here, Equus, from Hyracotherium was not a single pathway. We would start off with Hyracotherium, go to Meohippus, go to Merychippus, and then end up with Equus, because Equus was not the goal of evolution. Instead, it's just adaptive radiation allowed for the evolution of many, many different kinds of horse-like animals. So we see so many different kinds up here. Because natural selection is opportunistic. So wherever there was a possibility for evolution, the horses evolved that. However, the Equus is the only one, the modern horse, that was capable of surviving all of the pressures put on it by the environment and changes and everything like that. So that's the one that evolved. But it wasn't goal-oriented. Evolution was not working on making the perfect horse. It just so happened that that one was the one that was able to live and survive. So make sure that you read this chapter. There's some things in here that I did not mention in this video. Take the quiz. Good luck.